Welcome to the South Bay Midweek Prayer and Bible Study. I know you're going to enjoy today's presentation. The live session is even better because we pray together at the beginning. Feel free to join us Tuesdays at 6:30 p.m. You can find the link on our website. Now sit back and enjoy some spiritual refreshment.
I was not raised in the Adventist church. In fact, growing up, my one set of grandparents they were Methodists, sort of Methodists. My other grandmother was Church of the Nazarene. And I won't tell you the backstory to this, but I actually had a third set of grandparents, and they were really nothing. They didn't really go to church. They weren't much into the Bible or in any capacity. So growing up, I never really went to church much, minus what I went with my grandparents. And so I went some with both. My one set of grandparents were actually in a gospel singing group. So my grandpa sang, my uncle played piano, my grandmother played the drums, and they had a few other folks in their group. And growing up as I did, not going to church much, my last name is Peppers, and I had in the days when I used to have hair, my hair was fire red. So you can imagine going to public school. I went to public school because we never heard of church school. I had red hair with the last name Peppers. And so I always, used to get laughed at and made fun of. And God had mercy on me to let all my hair fall out eventually. So I would quit getting teased. But God gave me one blessing, and that was that I was always the biggest kid in my class. And so that was the joy that I had. And so a lot of the kids, they would make fun of me in one capacity, and then I would catch them on the playground on the next. And so that was always a benefit to me. I'm wanting to change this view. I'm seeing myself here. I'd rather see everybody else. So I'm trying to figure out how to do that. Maybe somebody can help me real quick.
You have to push gallery view.
There we go. I got it. There we go. Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate that, buddy. And so I went through school, and I eventually got into playing football, and I played junior high and high school football, and I became very good. In fact, I was probably the best in my school. And I was one of the first young people from my high school to have the potential to have a college football scholarship. And so my high school days were spent, often working out, trying to get better at sports and those kind of things. And there's a verse that really goes along with my testimony I want to share with you tonight. It's Jeremiah chapter 9. And verse 23 and 24. It's a very powerful verse. Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 23 and 24. And this really, I believe, sets the course for my entire life. And because, I'll just share with you in a minute. Verse 23. Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, let not the mighty man glory in his might, nor let the rich man glory in his riches. And at different stages of my life, I gloried in those three things. There was a time when I gloried in my wisdom. When I was in high school, I was the top of my class. I was in the top 10% of my class, and I rarely ever studied. And in college, the same thing. I was typically on the dean's list or the president's list without hardly ever studying. So there was a time when I gloried in my wisdom, my perceived wisdom, I should say. Then it says, let not the mighty man glory in his might. And I really did this when I was playing football, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Nor let the rich man glory in his riches. And there was a time very much so that I gloried in that. But verse 24 is what I want to hone in on. But let him who glories glory in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord, exercising loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness in the earth. For in these I delight. That's really the verse that I want to be the course of my life since I've known Christ. And so growing up, as I mentioned, I went to church some on occasion, but not very much. I was never very close to my dad. My dad was very distant from our family most of my life. And as you'll see a little bit later, it really turned into tragedy. So as I grew up, one of the very first things that happened to me when I was young to start doubting the existence of God was that at 5 years old, my grandmother was killed in a very tragic car accident. And so on Thanksgiving Day, my grandparents had their Thanksgiving meal, and they were on their way to some kind of social gathering with some friends. And as they were driving down the road, there was a man behind them who did not possess a driver's license because he had epilepsy. And so he decided that it would be a good idea to borrow his friend's car to go to the liquor store to buy liquor to celebrate Thanksgiving. So you can imagine what happened. As he was driving on the way to the liquor store, he had a seizure. And when he did, his foot pushed the gas pedal all the way to the floor, and his car accelerated, and he struck the back end of my grandparents' vehicle. And when he did, my grandfather was thrown out of the car and down the road. My grandmother was thrown through the passenger side window, and her head struck a telephone pole that was on the corner of the street there. And then she was pulled back into the car. Her friend in the back seat was instantly killed. I will save you the details of that, but it was very, very nasty. And when he struck them, the car, because of the force, went backwards, and he had a second seizure, and his foot hit the gas pedal a second time, and he struck them again. My grandmother hit the same telephone pole, was pulled back into the car, and pronounced dead at the scene. So both my grandmother and her friend were killed. As far as I've been told, that man walked away without ever having to, face any accountability or responsibility for what he did. And so I remember at 5 years old, walking into the funeral home, seeing we didn't see her, it was a closed casket, but seeing the casket of my grandmother and wondering, why is it that people die? Why? That was the first death of a relative or anyone close in my family. Why is it that people die? And why, if God was love, would he allow that? I remember thinking those thoughts at 5 years old. And because I had been to church with my grandparents, and I had been introduced to God through VBS and other little things, but I remember having that thought, and that stuck with me. And so the tragedy I continued to experience in my life was pretty traumatic. I went on into high school, and when I was in the 9th grade, my friends who were older than me, because I was very good at football, my friends would invite me to go with them on the weekends. And so we started camping, and of course, they started handing me alcohol and other things that were not obviously God's ideal. And at a very young age, I became addicted to alcohol. And so it started drinking on the weekends, and then it got to where we would drink some on the weeknights. And then even through the day when I was at school, I got to the place where I was participating in that. Became addicted to tobacco as well, and also, participated in some recreational drugs, not too heavily, but mostly it was alcohol. And so I became known, I got a reputation that I'm not proud of, but became known as the school drunk. And so by the time I was in 10th grade, I had this reputation. But at the same time, I was still almost a straight A student, still excelling in football. Thankfully, one thing God has done for me is he has sent a number of role models into my life. So I had a number of great coaches at that time. And one of them pulled me into his office and said to me, "You're really throwing your life away. And you have a chance here at something that no one else has had from our school, and that is a football scholarship." And he said, "If you don't change your course, you're going to throw that away, and your life's going to be a waste." And so that really kind of shook me up a little bit. And I decided to put all that away and focus on sports very heavily. So that's what I did. So by the time I was a senior, I was the best football player in the county. I had the school record for weightlifting. the maximum that I bench pressed was about 450 pounds. I used to squat 700 pounds. I used to leg press 1,800 pounds. And lest anyone thinks that's a great accomplishment, I now pay for it in different ways through, I tore my pectoral muscle in half. I have neck problems, knee problems. And so it's not something I would recommend. Needless to say, despite all of those things, I was very popular. I was kind of like the school hero, being so good at football. And so the community knew me very well, and everyone looked up to me. Unfortunately, I was considered a role model in high school. I was very popular. Everyone liked me. The teachers liked me. I was very well known, etc. And I say all that to say this. I had everything that the world says you need to have to be successful and happy going for me. That's what I had. I was popular. I was good in sports. I had good grades. I had a great future ahead. I was going to have a great job. I was going to go to college. I was going to be a school teacher and a football coach. That was my desire in life. And so everything that people say in the world, this is what you need to be successful, that's what I had. However, I didn't know it at this time, and I didn't understand why. My heart was still very empty. And I had all of this on the outside, yet on the inside, I struggled because I didn't know how to practice self-control. I didn't know how to have peace. At that time of my life, I was just chasing after anything that had the perception of happiness, whether it be video games, whether it be relationships, whether it be whatever. And all of those things ultimately were to my demise. I was actually very addicted to video games. And there was a time that I played video games for 3 days and 2 nights without sleeping, which was a terrible thing to do. And I read later in the news, a gentleman, a young man, actually the same age as me, that had done that, and he actually started having seizures, and it killed him because of a lack of sleep and an excess stimulation. It threw his mind into epilepsy, and so I don't recommend that. So there were 2 things that really changed the course of my life in high school, and that was, first, I had an injury. I had received all kinds of awards. I was being recruited by a number of universities to come and play football for them. And my senior year in high school, I had an injury. I actually blew out my knee in the 4th game of my senior season. And we were playing our biggest rival for that year. And there were a number of college football scouts there that were watching me. And my coach had told me, if you do well in this game, you're going to receive a number of scholarship offers from different universities. And so about halfway through that game, it was raining and it was very muddy. I actually stepped in a mud hole, and my foot got stuck in the mud hole. My body kept moving forward, and I twisted and I fell on my back. And I just laid there, and I knew that something was wrong. My football coach was about, 10 or 12 feet away. And he said he could hear my knees pop when he was even that far away from me. So I remember laying on my back and realizing, I think I'm finished with this. I think this is over for me. And sure enough, I went the next week to the doctor, and I remember sitting in the waiting room. I had an MRI or X-ray or whatever I had done, some kind of scan done. And I was sitting in the waiting room for the results. And I remember distinctly praying a very half-hearted prayer at that time of my life. God, if you care about me, if you love me, if you have any interest in my life, I want to still play football. Please let my knee be okay. And as soon as I prayed that prayer, the door opened, the doctor came in, and he told me, you've torn out your ACL, you've messed up you had a lot of meniscus damage. Your season is over. You're going to have reconstruction surgery. We're going to schedule that for next week. And so that was my confirmation that at that time of my life, I should say, that either God wasn't real, or B, he didn't care about me. And so that was a real hardening moment in my life. because my idol, my God, was sports. It was an idol. It was a God. It was a false God in my life, and I was worshiping that. Little did I know, even when I prayed that prayer, that was the very beginning of a path that God was using to lead me to a place of surrender to him. I didn't know that at the time. Obviously, looking back, I know that now. The second thing that was very significant in my life was when my parents were divorced. Now, my mother discovered when I was about 15 years old that my dad was seeing other people, and she had not known this, but he had suddenly had to start taking a number of work trips away for the weekend and so forth. And we ended up finding out that he was seeing other people. And it was a very traumatic experience that we went through. My mother, who at that time was a very strong person, she was very strong, but when that began to happen, she began to lose control of herself. And I remember there were a number of instances that led up to kind of a climax of this, where she would chase my dad around, and she caught him. I'm trying to be careful here I know we have some young people here, but she would catch him in a number of compromising situations. And I remember once that she called me and she said, "I found your dad and he's with his girlfriend. You need to show up at such and such a place." So I got in my car. I was 16 or 17 at the time. We drove to this particular location, and my dad was parked, and he had this woman in the vehicle. And so my mom was confronting him about this, and she was, interacting with my dad. And I remember this just very distinctly, that my dad just kind of finally cut her off, and he said to my mother, "I'm very sorry, but I love her. I don't love you anymore." And when he said that, of course, here I am, just a young person, hearing my father say that to my mother. It was like a knife through my heart. And so my mother actually dove through the car, the vehicle, and was trying to choke my father. And she was hanging halfway out the vehicle, and I grabbed her by the legs and pulled her out. And when I did, she reached into her purse, and she actually had a pistol, and she was pulling out that pistol, and she was going to try to kill my dad. And so when I saw that, I grabbed her hand and pushed it down, and I told my dad, "You better get out of here quick, because she's about to kill you." And so my dad left. And there were a number of instances like this. I could tell you 50 stories or more of things to that magnitude that we endured. His one girlfriend was not a very nice person, and she had all of our utilities cut off. This was at the point when my dad eventually had moved out of the house, and it was just my mom and my sister and myself. And she had all of our utilities cut off. She had our dog poisoned. We had people that would show up at our house at 3:00 in the morning and bang on all the doors and windows, fire shots in our yard. I mean, this was just ongoing chaos in our lives. And I'm just trying to make it through high school. My sister is 5 years younger than me. She's 11, 12 years old. And my dad would make a number of promises to her, and he would never keep them. And so it had a very traumatizing effect on my sister. So this is the environment I grew up in. And there was one particular day that I came home from school, and my mom was laying on the couch. And as she was laying on the couch, I went in and I noticed that her speech was very slurred. And, I just knew that something was off. And so I called my dad. He came over, he talked to her, and then he was about to leave. And he said, "Well, I'm going to go get some medicine. Your mom is sick. I'm going to go get some medicine. I'll be back just in a few minutes." Well, 30 minutes went by. He didn't come back. An hour went by. He didn't come back. I tried to call his phone. He had turned his phone off. And eventually I called my grandparents. I'm just a young man. I didn't know what was happening. My sister was younger than me. They said, call an ambulance right now. So I did. And it turns out that my mother had attempted suicide. She took 25 sleeping pills, trying to go to sleep and never wake up. A little later, I finally reached my dad and confronted him about this, and actually learned that she had told him what she had done, and he actually left her there to die. He had intended for her to die because he wanted her out of his life, and he wanted her to leave him alone because she continued to disrupt his new life that he was trying to establish. And so when I learned that, I just really lost all respect for my dad. And I actually told him that I never wanted to see him again. And when he died, I was going to attend his funeral for the sole purpose of spitting on his grave. And there's a lot more that went with that, but for time's sake, we'll have to save it for another time. But that was really a defining moment for me, because I had no interest in any kind of spiritual things from that point on. And in fact, shortly after, I went to college and I was taking an American literature class. And in that book, there was a series of letters written between correspondence between Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson. Now, if you ever read the book Early Writings, Ellen White writes almost, or I think literally, an entire chapter about Thomas Paine, the life of Thomas Paine. And she says that the devil himself often stood over his shoulder, guiding his writing. Very interesting. And not only that, she says also in that same chapter that he will rise in the second resurrection. And so she doesn't say that about too many people, but she says it about him. So I was reading these letters that he was writing to Thomas Jefferson and listing all the reasons why he didn't believe in God. And Thomas Jefferson would write back and he would list all the reasons why he did believe in God. And so there was this correspondence, and I read through all of that. And at the end of that, because of the arguments made by Thomas Paine and because of my own personal life experiences, I came to the conclusion that there was no God. I labeled myself a self-proclaimed atheist. And from that point on, it only got worse. I went to a state university, and I was there studying anthropology, studying geology, I have a major in geography with an emphasis in archaeology. So I was studying evolution and all of the theories associated with it. My professors were very hardcore atheists, and they used to actually make jokes about Christians in the class. And so there I was in secular university studying to that end. And so I really went off the deep end, so to speak. And, in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, you find where Solomon speaks and he says, whatever my heart desired, I did not withhold myself from it. And that became my experience. I was very much into many things, which I won't get into here, but my life literally became a whirlwind downward. I became addicted to alcohol again. I was addicted to other things you can imagine on the internet. I got to the place where I would drink literally almost a case of alcohol every day. And it was very, very traumatic. And I had a deep bitterness in my heart for my family, especially my dad. I watched my entire family literally dissolve before my eyes. I blamed my dad very much for that. And still to this day, my family is almost virtually non-existent. I mean, my parents now are still alive. My mother actually lived from that incident, but she's very much like a child. So I don't even talk to, I haven't seen or talked to my dad in over 3 years. Not my choice, but his. And I actually, when I accepted the Lord, I asked his forgiveness for the way that I had treated him. But even to this day, he still really has no interest in being associated with our family. So he doesn't even see my kids. And so I was literally in my early 20s, very much a hardcore atheist, hated Christians, hated Christianity, would often have young students who were fellow students who were Christians would try to invite me to campus crusade things or campus for Jesus or whatever, and I would send them away in tears. I remember my own mother was trying to recover from this divorce. She became very emotionally unstable, and she would cry a lot, and it was just very difficult for her. She still never really recovered from it. But I used to tell my own mother that there is no God. I would tell her, there is no God. Do not try to associate yourself in any way with Christianity, because it's only for weak-minded people. I said, you need to be strong for yourself. You need to make yourself better. Spirituality will only confuse you. Told my younger sister, who was 12 years old, there's no God. Gave her all the reasons why there was no God. And it was very, very tragic. I'm very ashamed of the life that I lived. And I only tell it to you. I only say any of those things because I want you to see the place where I was at and how powerful God's grace was to pull me out. Well, I reached a place where I was so depressed in that life that I actually played 2 years of college football and, was trying to be successful. I mentioned I gloried in my wisdom. I gloried in my might. I gloried in my riches. I had a very good job where I compiled a large sum of money that I ultimately wasted, like the prodigal son. And so I was at a low point in my life. I became so depressed that I literally had 5 alarm clocks beside my bed that would go off in the morning, and I would not even hear them. That's how depressed I was. I would stay up late at night. I would, addicted to video games, all of these things. And I reached a place where I was very much so dissatisfied with life where I said, why even continue to live? I considered suicide, and I was ready to carry that out at any time. The only thing that kept me from doing it, and the very same day I began to think about it, is that I was so bitter and angry that I wanted to do it in such a way that my family would be responsible or feel responsible for that for the rest of their life. So I wanted for my family to feel the guilt and the weight of my decision to commit suicide. And so I began to think and plan how I could do that. Well, at the very same time I was thinking about that, I started to have these thoughts. It wasn't a voice, it was just an impression, a thought in my mind. Why don't you study the Bible? Why don't you study the Bible? And so I didn't understand or know where that thought was coming from because I had no interest in studying the Bible. And the first time I thought that, I thought, man, that's really crazy because I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. But the more I tried to put that thought out of my mind, the stronger it became. So I was 22 years old, living in a college apartment with 3 roommates, no influence of God in my life. There wasn't a Seventh-day Adventist church for miles around. I don't think literally there was any Seventh-day Adventists on the entire campus. There's very few Adventists in the area that I lived to begin with, much less on a secular state university. But I had one uncle he and my aunt at that time were the only Seventh-day Adventists in my family. My uncle became an Adventist through an Amazing Facts Bible prophecy seminar about 15 years before that point. So I thank God for public evangelism because it brought my uncle in. My family before that had never even heard of Seventh-day Adventists. I had nobody in my family had ever even heard of it. He was an alcoholic. He was a pot smoker. He would curse like a sailor, but he liked prophecy. He used to watch Nostradamus. He liked prophecy, and he got a flyer in the mail. And so he went to those meetings, and he became the first Seventh-day Adventist in my family. Very fascinating story in and of itself. But my uncle gave me some amazing facts Bible study guides. And even though I had told him, stop giving me religious stuff, I don't want any of it, some time passed. And when I had this conviction, he gave me those amazing fact study guides. And I thought it was a very strange coincidence because I had made this agreement with myself to study the Bible to try to prove it false. So I took those lessons. I went to my college apartment and I opened this dusty old Bible that my grandmother had given me as a kid. And I started studying those amazing facts Bible study lessons. I went through them one by one. I went to the university library and I checked all the world history that the lessons were showing through the prophecies, and it was all accurate. And I came to the conclusion that the Bible absolutely, beyond the shadow of a doubt, had to be true. There was no doubt about it. The prophecies had foretold. This is why Daniel and Revelation are so powerful, because they are the answer to the skeptic. They're the answer to the atheist. Why doesn't God intervene in the world today? He has, and he does. And many of the things we see in the world today playing out are described thousands of years ago in ancient scripture. And so I became so convinced. I went to my atheistic professors and I was sharing with them what I had learned. And they literally had no answer for me. I said, how is it possible, if God doesn't exist, that in these prophecies, it lays out world history with perfect accuracy in great detail? They didn't have an answer. They literally looked at me and blankly and said, we really don't have time to talk to you about this. We don't know the answers to those things, but we still don't believe it. They couldn't answer it. And so at that point in my life, I realized I was at a crossroads. I was going to have to decide whether I was going to follow what I had learned to be true or not. And so at 22 years old, I was studying one of the lessons, and it gave an invitation for you to accept Christ. And at that time in my life, I knelt down by myself in my college apartment and I accepted Christ as my Savior. I still remember the words. I said, Lord, I choose you because you chose me. And I invite you into my life to cleanse me of sin. I felt myself to be so unworthy because of my life. I was very scared to come to God and ask him to forgive me. But I read the verse in John 6:37-38, all that come to me will come to me, and the one who comes to me, I will by no means cast away. That was the verse that allowed me to believe that God could cleanse even me. And I gave my life to Christ. And I'll tell you, friends, there was no flash of light in the room. There was no voice from heaven or no thunder or no angel that appeared, but I could sense the presence of God there in that moment. And there was a weight that rolled away, just like, in Pilgrim's Progress, when Christian went to the cross, that burden on his back was lifted. And that was my experience with the Lord. And I'll tell you, I've not been perfect since. I know that there's been a lot of growth, but by the grace of God, he's led me. And I'm thankful for the course he's led me eventually into ministry. And I can say by the grace of God, since that time, my cousin, his wife, his wife's mother, my sister, my nephew, and even my mother have been baptized into the church, all first-generation Adventists. And it's been a great privilege for me to serve in ministry in many capacities. The Lord called me into the ministry, but quite literally, I haven't had the great upbringing that many of you have had, but the Lord has still been gracious to me, and for that I'm thankful. So there's a lot more to the story, but that's our time. It's 7:21. But I do want to just make a brief appeal to you tonight and say, wherever you're at in your life, you may say, well, I was raised in the church, or maybe I wasn't, or maybe you're at a place in your life where you're in a dark moment. We have those sometimes. We wrestle. The devil tries to discourage us. I want to appeal to you tonight to reach out to the Lord in faith, trust the promises that he has provided in Scripture, and lean on those. Put your whole heart into them and surrender yourself to them. and the Lord will be right there to meet you. His grace is sufficient, and his grace is powerful to bring not just forgiveness, not just cleansing, but transformation. He'll do that for us tonight. That's my prayer for you today.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We hope you found today's presentation to be a blessing to you. And it's never good to keep things to yourself. It's always best to share them. So find someone that you can share what you have been blessed with others. If you enjoyed today's presentation, let us know by hitting the like button and subscribe to this channel if you want to know when there's new presentations coming out. God bless. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.